All right. Welcome to Chapter 11, Advertising and Commercial Culture. Now, as we go through this chapter on advertising, take careful notes or whatever you need in order to retain a lot of the information from this chapter, because I'm going to ask you to compare many of the broad concepts discussed in Chapter 11, Advertising, with the chapter that deals with public relations, which we will cover next week, because they're very similar, but they're not the same. But I'm going to want you to sort of identify or isolate some of those differences. So starting out with this slide, dollars always follow the eyeballs. It's sort of almost a warning, a caution that many of you with smartphones can expect your telephone to become the major advertising medium in the next decades, because that's where we tend to go for information first, and that advertising will soon follow. But first, I glance back historically. And in terms of looking at the first advertising agencies, the idea of newspapers, space broker, there was a guy by the name of Palmer, and what he did, he was the most notable space broker back in the time in the early 1800s, and he would purchase at discounted rates large quantities of newspaper space, and then he would turn around and sell them to companies for advertisements. Later on in the 1800s, the Ayer & Son became one of the largest advertising agencies throughout that particular century. They are responsible for these two ads. Here we have Morton Salt, the idea of when it rains, it pours. This was developed in the early 1800s. And this is an advertisement developed in the 1890s, obviously for Coca-Cola. So in terms of trademark and packaging, what this refers to is the notion that manufacturers began to realize that if they could make their products look distinctive and connect them or associate it with quality, that people would then begin to ask by those particular products by name. In terms of patent medicines and department stores, all the advertising in the 1800s was about 50%. 50% these two industries, patent medicines and department stores. It's certainly not like that today, but very interesting. In terms of impact on newspapers, in the mid-1800s, about 70 to 75% news and the rest was ads. But by the early 1900s, more than half, greater than 50%, was ads. And so there's a tremendous shift. And obviously, it's reversed dramatically more recently since the recession. And many advertising agencies are completely fleeing newspapers altogether. And the revenue from advertising has dropped dramatically since about maybe 2005. In terms of promoting social change, dictating values, advertising has had a role in that. It has led to social change in a couple of different ways. It certainly helped motivate the transition from a focus on the producer and the manufacturer of the products to the consumer who purchases those products. And that's a pretty dramatic social shift. That has had an influence on technology and economic growth, of course, as well. In terms of emphasizing the appeals to women, advertisers pretty quickly realized that women were the predominant decision makers in terms of any household products, and so advertising began to be geared toward the housewife, the traditional housewife. And here in the corner we have an ad for Pierre's soap, and certainly was one of the most popular brands of soap in the 1800s and 1900s. And by the way, advertising was one of the earliest business opportunities that was available to women, which is interesting. In terms of some controversy, advertising was accused of inciting consumer need for unnecessary products, and so was born one of the newspaper, or rather advertising watchdogs, the idea of the Ad Council, and that was a fairly significant influence. In terms of U.S. advertising today, Well, no longer is the slogan the king, which prior up to about 1960s, it was all about the slogan, all about having the catchy phrase. Now it's about the image. Now it's about the picture. Now it's about the graphic. And visual design has had a big history in terms of its connection to advertising. Two types of advertising agencies, those mega agencies, which are typically these fairly significant conglomerates, usually with offices located all over the world, and these boutique agencies, which are very small, specific, tailored to a particular industry, just a couple of independent designers and so on, that deal with advertising on a much smaller scale. Early ad regulations. You have these four predominant, these are some of the largest regulation entities that exist, the BBC, the ABC, the FTC, and of course the American Association of Advertising Agencies. And they're all about regulating advertising, and these are discussed in some detail in terms of the textbook. In terms of subliminal advertising, it's actually illegal. And there are a lot of guidelines regulating subliminal advertising. Do a little Google search and you can find some really interesting examples of subliminal advertising. And honestly, many of them deal with sex, and some of the images are, honestly too graphic for the PowerPoint that I want to show. So this is one of the more mild one, and it's the idea of, gosh, if you look at where the S Skittle is down there next to the explosion word, and there's a certain three-letter word that sort of jumps to your mind. And this is candy, and the predominant consumers of this product are kids. So certainly the generated some controversy. This is a graphic that's in your textbook, but I think it's worth repeating here in terms of looking at where the advertising dollars go. And it is largely expected that the internet, particularly in social media, that this slice of the pie will continue to grow and grow and grow. And certainly newspapers are becoming less and less. In terms of the structure of the typical advertising agency, you have these four major roles: the account planner, the creative development person, media coordination, and account and client management. And account planning has a lot to do with trying to get the views of the client, the creative team, the consumer, all to work together. And market research, which is part of this, assesses the behavior, the attitudes of consumers. And then they also come up with something called the VALS strategy, and VALS, and that stands for the Values and Lifestyle Strategy, which basically divides and places consumers into a psychographic profile. And once that profile is established, then particular strategies are used to market to that VALS category. So I'm going to have you take a VALS survey later on in this learning unit, and I think that you might find that interesting. Creative development, this is the writer and the artist, and obviously they deal with, they're the nerve center of the creative team. Media coordination, this is the whole planning, placing advertising. You've got media buyers and that select the best outlet and so on and so forth. And account and client management. Certainly these are the people that go out and bring in new business. They also manage the accounts of existing clients and so on and so forth. Different trends in online advertising. There are a lot of different types. Online advertising is certainly the fastest growing part of the advertising industry, and specializes in a lot of banners and pop-up ads, and of course a lot of spam as well. I'm sure you get more than enough of this and you've seen plenty of it. Leading advertisers are moving more of their campaigns to digital media, and basically the internet's drawing a lot more consumers away from the traditional mass media. Same with politics, by the way, and that gets interesting. It's a lot more targeted toward individuals because a marketer can develop a particular consumer profile, and then establish cookies on your computer. And so there are things specifically tailored toward you and your interests, and that troubles a lot of people. And there's a lot of agencies that are don't think that's right. So it's an interesting debate to consider. In terms of social media, I've included a very short but very interesting and well done small YouTube video that talks about social media marketing. And here we have just a few of the predominant social medias that you can appeal to. In terms of placement techniques in contemporary advertising, certainly there are a lot of different strategies. Your book will talk about these persuasive strategies, and there's a whole list of them. You can go to them for details. Obviously, a testimonial is one of the most important. Association principle. In this one, the ad associates a product with a positive image or positive value, and so you have that association, and that's what sells it. Disassociation is where you link a new idea, a new brand with something that's a little outside the box, something a little eccentric, and that has its own appeal to a different population. The idea of advertising is myth, that the idea that ads are narratives and they have social conflicts that they're trying to resolve, and so on and so forth. In terms of product placement, this is how companies nowadays have become very, very effective at placing their ads in a variety of different shows. Here's a very short commercial. It's a Bud Light commercial. I'm not promoting drinking, let me just say that. But I think that you'll find this interesting. It's very clever.
God! What's that doing on my set?
Product placement, sir. Whenever we feature a product in a scene, we get tons of free stuff.
Here we go. Really? Hi, lady. Sure sign of a good time. Just right taste of Bud Light. Here we go. More Bud Light?
Very little commercial. You can Google product placement and you'll get some great sort of collages of different product placement advertising. A lot of the TV that you and I watch and the films that you and I have seen. All right, in terms of back to the PowerPoint, commercial speech, regulating advertising. There are a lot of critical issues, whether it's children in advertising, whether it's advertising at school, which also exists, whether it's health and advertising, and that covers things from eating disorders to tobacco to alcohol to prescription drugs. A lot of watchdogs currently exist. Talked about some of them earlier, but they look at things like excessive commercialism. At what point is enough enough? There are certain channels that you may watch on TV that they have great films, but every 5 minutes is a 5-minute commercial break, and it just gets insane. And in terms of alternative voices, here your textbook discusses the Truth anti-tobacco campaign, which many people are familiar with, that has been one of the most effective alternative voices in this. In terms of advertising, politics, and democracy, certainly advertising has played a role in politics, whether it's political airtime, which has its own controversy. In terms of a future of advertising, a lot of that has the notion of commercialism, and your book explores that. So anyways, my phone's ringing, and that's 14 hours of this, so I think we're done.